Welcome to DIA Today, Democracy in America Today. I'm Matt Parks alongside Dave Corbin. Glad to have you with us as we explore the ideas behind today's headlines. How you doing, Dave?
I'm doing well. Getting ready for what we think will be a school year on Monday, but changes by the minute or the hour or the day. I won't get into details for those of you who work at the same college that I do. We've had an interesting week, but we move forward, and our name is Providence, so we always trust in an all-powerful God. So
that's the only way to make it through 2020. I was sending out notes to some of my students with my provisional plans for the semester, and I have in bold, as all things are in 2020, this is subject to change, right? Exactly. You always have that language on your syllabus, just sort of reserving the right to make changes, but you feel the burden of that, especially this coming year. I mean, there's just, everything is subject to change. It's a good reminder that we are not in charge and that God is.
Yes.
Well, so the big political headline obviously this week was Joe Biden's selection of Kamala Harris as his ticket mate, vice presidential nominee for the Democratic Party. But we've talked about that already. And so what we thought we would do, rather than delve further into that debate, and we'll focus on the conventions the next 2 weeks anyway, was to take a step back and look at the future of conservatism. Now, since the end of June, the American Conservative magazine has been publishing periodic essays on their website in a symposium on American conservatism. And they're up to about 22 pieces to date from writers that represent a range of conservative positions. And so we're going to use those pieces and some classic conservative texts to talk about the future of the conservative movement in this populist Trump era and beyond. And the inspiration for that symposium and also for our discussion is a book written over 50 years ago that was edited by Frank Meyer, often called the intellectual godfather of the modern conservative movement, one of the people that put together the coalition that eventually led to political successes like the election of Ronald Reagan, but also tried to give a coherent philosophical underpinning to that conservative movement. So he edited this book called What is Conservatism, published in 1964. And that was kind of the backdrop for this series of essays in the American Conservative. And so we thought we would do was actually start there. That'll be our required reading. We're going to start with our required reading. Flip the script. Sorry about that. For those of you creatures of habit, good conservative creatures of habit, we're going to flip the script here. Let Dave lead off with required reading, and then allow that to interact with our headlines, which will be reflections on those American conservative pieces. So with that, Dave, what have you got for us?
So we're putting them to sleep first and then waking people up with the headlines thereafter.
We'll wake them up later. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
Sounds good. All right. I can do this. So I love Meyer. I love his writing style. I love what he was after. I think he was very interesting person because he was someone very active within the broader conservative libertarian movement, but also you can tell from reading him that he had an amazing gift to understand this kind of difficult and complex world that we live in and our place within it. But what I want to do before getting to his 1964 essay, What is Conservatism, the book that he edited, is I want to first I think give you Meyer's metaphysics that he delivers to us in a later book written in 1968, and a chapter of that book titled Western Civilization, The Problem of Freedom. So I want to start there and kind of lay out how Meyer sees the world, and we'll have the link to this really, really terrific essay on our site. And then I'll go to the questions he brings up in what is conservatism before we go on to the headlines and kind of more contemporary responses to it.
You really are serious about putting everyone to sleep.
I am. Yes, exactly. We're going to start off metaphysical and then go from there.
Let's do it.
So the claim that Meyer makes at the beginning of this essay, Western Civilization, the Problem of Freedom, is that of all the civilizations in world history, Western civilization is unique. So why is Western civilization unique? The answer is that any civilizational order, he argues, derives from the way in which it organizes the life and outlook of the individual persons who compose it in their relations to the universe in which they live. So I'll say that again. All civilizational orders derive from the way they organize the life and outlook of individual persons who compose that civilization in their relations to the universe in which they live. So he says at the beginning of the essay that for the first 2,500 years of recorded history, all men lived in what he called cosmological unities. And what he means by this phrase, a cosmological unity, where there's no difference between the temporal world and the transcendent world, that everyone's existence is subsumed, every individual's existence is subsumed by a declaration of truth that penetrates everything for that person. Up until, and this is where the West becomes unique, up until the appearance of two new civilizations, the Greeks of classical civilization and the Jews of Syriac civilization. He says that these two civilizations shattered the unity, the cosmological unity of the combining of the historic world and the cosmic world. They burst asunder the unity of what ought to be and what is. And it faced individual men for the first time with the necessity of a deep-going moral choice. Meyer goes on to say, in a word, it destroyed the unity of what is done by human beings and what they should do to reach the heights their nature opens to them. So what he's suggesting here, and for those of you who have studied political philosophy with Professor Parker, you always hear us mention kind of the transcendent world of the ought and the immanent world of the is, kind of the eternal and the historical. What Meyer is arguing here is that the reason why we can think about that dichotomy that the way that we do in the West is because of the influence of Judeo-Christianity on the one hand and Greek philosophy on the other hand. Where do we get these two parts of the world from the Judaic prophetic experience? Well, here we have the notion, right, that mankind can be an individual, covenantal, but also an individual inheritor of prophecy, right? So we can hear the word of God, and that word of God can move us to understand where God is transcendently and where we are in the world that is. And we feel that difference between where we are and where he is and what we ought to be doing. And if you go further in the Judeo-Christian tradition, Christ coming into the world is the word made flesh, is the transcendent made immanent that ties the whole human experience together. Well, similarly, Meyer argues that in Greek philosophy, the fact that the individual human being, through Socrates, or Plato's coverage of Socrates, is able to be a pursuer of wisdom or truth by using their reason to reflect upon the world, all of a sudden opens up to individual man a pathway to the transcendent from his immanent placing. So why is this all important to Meyer? For Meyer, not only is Western civilization unique, but Western civilization is correct, or has been correct, or has opened up to mankind the greatest prospect for all humanity. To be able to live in this world of the immanent, but to have an ability to access the transcendent leads to states of human flourishing that would not exist had we not had that opportunity. So the great benefit that we have as human beings living in Western civilization is we have access to this way of looking at the world. The great problem is that we also have access to looking at this world. Why is it a great problem? Well, here Meyer would point to the 20th century experience, and not just simply the 20th century experience. There have been other experiences of this utopian desire of mankind living within the immanent world to bring heaven down to earth, to go back to this cosmological unity that once pervaded all civilizations. And he talks about that as being a great danger because in order to create that cosmological unity, you have to tyrannize over the immanent world. So that's kind of one danger being placed in this position as we are. The other danger that we also see in Western civilization and Western history is to deny the possibility whatsoever of the transcendent. In Machiavelli's words in chapter 15 of The Prince, right, to leave imagined republics and principalities behind, and to simply just focus on the immanent, and to do what you will in this world of immanence. So two great dangers, a danger towards utopianism by trying to bridge the immanent and the transcendent, or the anarchic or pathway to nihilism in which you just set aside a transcendent reality. Have I lost you or put you to sleep yet, Matt?
No, I'm still with you. No, I think this is helpful. I think, we have to appreciate that the ancient civilizations that he's looking at, kind of the landscape, the story they're telling is the gods have established the world that you live in. That is the world as it therefore must be, as it ought to be. And so you're not really in a position to critique that. It's not proper to critique that. You just submit to that and you continue down that path indefinitely until your neighbor conquers you and you've got new gods, a new story that you've got to adopt. But with the emergence of biblical worldview, first in the Old Testament scriptures and then more fully with the New Testament as well, we're put in this difficult position of having to sort out the is and the ought, because we recognize, and obviously this is right there at the very beginning of Genesis, that a world that began very good is now a fallen world. And yet there's still a call to holiness. There's still a righteousness that's demanded, but we don't see that. And the world around us is an is that's very far removed from the ought. And yet, to complicate it further, there's a promise at the end of Revelation that there will be an actual realization of that ought. But it won't be one that we bring about. It won't be the result of human political action. And so we have to live with this uneasy tension between our knowledge of the flaws and faults of this world and our expectation of a better world without, just as you're saying, throw our hands up and say, forget about that world to come. We'll just live beastly lives as base creatures in a fallen world. Or no, we demand that world to come now, and therefore we're going to force everybody to live according to our vision of what that world would look like.
What Meyer says is that there's no solution there's no earthly solution to these temptations being there. Well, why? Because order is necessary to the West, but as is freedom necessary to the West. And we tend to want to gravitate toward one or another and discard the other that we don't like. And this creates an imbalance in our political outlook, in our theological outlook, and so on. So anyway, near the end of this essay, and it's very, very interesting for us, he references in particular the American political experience. What is it that's unique about the American founding fathers, and we've seen this and we've talked about this in the show on multiple occasions, what they're after in both the Declaration of Independence and a government system that frames our idea of justice is they're after ordered liberty, right? So there is certainly, and we see this in the Federalist Papers, we see this in many founding documents, there are clear declarations of moral principles, of moral rightness, of justice, et cetera. And yet there's an allowance for people, right, to make choices, to consent to how they're governed, et cetera. So for Meyer, the founders in particular would be, I think, an exemplar of a group that brought into being a regime that at its best probably best enables these tensions to coexist without moving in one direction or another. However, there will always be that utopian temptation. And I think certainly we see that also in American history in particular, in the temptations that we've fallen prey to after the Civil War and in the rise of progressivism.
Right.
So I think that, unless you want to say more, Matt, I think that sets up Meyer's or editing of a book titled "What is Conservatism?" Nicely, because it kind of sets the stage for what is conservatism going to be in the middle of the 20th century. Meyer, in the first chapter of this book, Freedom, Tradition, and Conservatism, will identify the utopian temptation as collectivist liberalism. We could also call it progressivism. The idea, really, I believe, that we do not, to use Herbert Crowley's famous progressives idea, we have not fulfilled the meaning of America or of democracy unless we've been able to actualize equality through collectivist liberalism. So that's the driving force behind American politics, latter half of the 19th century, first half of the 20th century, a type of politics that Meyer says by the 1950s has been disproven intellectually, but that is ironically very powerful in terms of its hold upon the Democratic and Republican Party. Broadly conservative thinkers have seen collectivist liberalism or progressivism for what it is and have responded to it with a way of thinking about the world, harks back to the founding, harks back to the embrace of the desire for order on one hand, or the human gravitation towards order on one hand and human gravitation towards liberty on the other. And I think he kind of suggests here that this conservative movement is a good movement because it abstracts from the corpus of Western belief in its stress upon freedom and upon the innate importance of the individual person, what we may call a libertarian position, and those who, drawing upon the same source, stress value and virtue and order, what we may call the traditionalist position. So let me back up there and restate what I think he's arguing here. Conservatism at its intellectual height in the 20th century is on the mark to the degree that it rightly understands the human need for order and the human need for freedom, and has within its kind of collected group of intellectuals some who are going to make the case more in the direction of freedom, and some who are going to make the case more in the direction of virtue and order. But as you see, Matt, that will tend to fall apart.
Well, of course, the challenge is having individuals who hold those positions dear and seeing others who don't value that first principle that they consider the most valuable, dissenting from that position. The tendency is to be critical and to attack, right? And to argue, well, we can't make common cause with this group because they don't appreciate the importance of virtue, or we can't make a common cause with this group because they don't appreciate the importance of freedom. And so I think what he's trying to do is to speak to both those groups and say, wait a second, understand your own position better, and you might find you have more in common than you realize with those that could be your partners, but sometimes feel like your enemies.
Exactly. And I think that this problem is exacerbated by the fact that, as he'll state later on in the essay, that conservatives are having to fight an intellectual war with collectivist liberals. And in fighting that war, they have to kind of shift gears. They have to become more militant in their advocacy for conservatism. And they're, rather than, he uses the word, rather than being enabled to be natural conservatives who kind of naturally defend this corpus of Western belief, they've got to ardently defend it. And when they ardently defend it, trying to restore it, they tend to emphasize one of the two tensions to a greater degree. So the libertarian under attack in the middle of the 20th century is going to go that much further in the defense of individual freedom and be that much more willing to kind of set aside the importance of virtue and order in fighting their progressive foe. And likewise, if you're someone who claims that what's essential to that Western corpus of belief is the order and the virtuous activity that goes along with it. So the more ramped up we are, the less likely that we are to see that other part of the tension that's essential to the whole Western picture.
I think he's got an important historical insight here, which I think in the pieces that we're going to look at a little bit later on, people are arguing that we are in the same historical context, that to just hold on to the tradition right now is to hold on to a revolution. A person whose natural disposition is conservative is holding on to things, has to find a way to respond to things that ought not to be held on to.
Yeah, and this, I think, leads us to the next concept that he forwards at the beginning of this book, right? He's writing the opening chapter. He says, this is our situation. And I think what's kind of interesting, as you mentioned, Matt, is he's saying this is our situation in 1964. Well, this is our situation in 2020 as well. So what is Meyer's remedy? What is he going to offer or suggest is going to be offered in this edited book? So he writes, what is required of us is a conscious conservatism. What's required of us is a conscious conservatism, a clearly principled restatement in new circumstances of philosophical and political truth. So he's saying that's true in 1964. I think we could say very much if we agree with Meyer that that's true in 2020. This conscious conservatism cannot be a simple piety, although in a deep sense it must have piety toward the constitution of being. Nevertheless, in its consciousness, it necessarily reflects a reaction to the rude break the revolution, progressive, collectivist, liberal revolution, has made in the continuity of human wisdom. It is called forth by a sense of the loss which that cutting off has created. It cannot now be identical with the natural conservatism towards which it yearns. The world in which it exists is a revolutionary world. To accept that, to conserve that, would be to accept and conserve the very denial of men's long-developed understanding, the very destruction of achieved truth, which are the essence of the revolution. Nor can the conscious conservatism required of us appeal simply and uncomplicatedly to the past. The past has had many aspects, all held in measured suspension, but the revolution has destroyed that suspension, that tradition. The delicate fabric can never be recreated in the identical form. Its integral character has been destroyed. I'll end with this. The conscious conservatism of a revolutionary or post-revolutionary era faces problems inconceivable to the natural conservatism of a pre-revolutionary time. What he's going to suggest here, what I think he's suggesting here, if we're going to apply what he has to say to 2020, is yes, a conscious conservatism is required of us. A clearly principled restatement in new circumstances of philosophical and political truth is required of us, but that restatement of philosophical and political truth must take into account the very circumstances in which we live, which calls upon us work through what's happened, work through the development of collectivist liberalism right up until the present day. How has it shifted? How has it changed? And how can we restate our principles, countering that progressive revolution that's up to date and that takes into account our current exigencies? Would you agree with that, Matt? Or
no, I think that's the challenge, and I think that's why there's a symposium in 2020 that has such a range of views.
Yeah, and I think it requires us. I think it also requires us to do the following, and I'm interested in what your take is on this. I've read through the 22 pieces, and if I'm understanding Meyer correctly, it also requires us to understand the revolution well. It requires us to understand the other well. So the other, at his time, he calls the collectivist liberal. Is that the same revolutionary force that we're dealing with in 2020, or is it a different type of liberal? Because if it is, then our response to it and our restatement of principle may have to be a little bit different, and our way forward may have to be a little bit different. And let me just quickly, before we get to the headlines, take a shot at that. I've argued in most of the essays that I've written in the last 10 or 15 years that what I believe is the great danger in the latest recreation of progressive liberalism is this development to see the world along the following lines. Anything that is transcendent is indeterminate. Anything that is moral in content or philosophic in content, what I would call the latest rendering of the liberal will say can't be solved. It's a mystery. So any effort to make a claim for moral or philosophical certitude about the transcendent world is rejected offhand. But on the other hand, the latest recreation of the liberal suggests that everything within the immanent realm is determinate. Everything within it can be measured or counted. And at the end of the day, no judgment that questions simple material determinacy is correct. So I would argue that the type of liberal that we're dealing with in the 21st century is a liberal who's taken that end of history thesis to the nth degree. They've taken philosophical liberalism in the direction of nihilism, and they've taken economic liberalism to the reduction of all things being material, and that is that's a horrible predicament for the human being. But that if that's the case, I think that the conservatives' charge in the 21st century would be to winsomely respond to that worldview. So let's see whether or not, if I'm on the mark, whether that's happening in the headlines that make up these essays that respond to Meyer's essay.
So just as a transition to our discussion of these pieces, the basic Meyer's position is called fusionism. And the fusionist argument is that we can take the libertarian conservative emphasis on freedom, and we can take the traditionalist conservative emphasis on virtue and order. And as we press upon those things, we find that there's some ultimate compatibility insofar as freedom to be of any value must be exercised in the context of virtue. Otherwise, it's just a beastly expression of animalistic desire. And on the other hand, the pursuit of virtue and order has to be chosen. And so actual genuine virtue can't be forced upon a person. It has to be an expression that emerges out of the heart, right? A desire to act in a certain way. And so Meyer essentially argues that we can hold these two ideas together, these two groups together in some political union that might be large enough to actually accomplish political goals if we can appreciate that my love of freedom rests upon your love of virtue, and your love of virtue requires my love of freedom. And so as we explore this symposium, I think there's really two questions that I think maybe help us to organize this and apply it to the present moment. First question, is fusionism still a viable intellectual and political foundation for conservatism moving forward? Is this actual formulation still available to us? And then secondly, if it's not, what should replace it as the heart of an intellectually sound, politically viable conservative movement? So I want to assume that we have to have both those things, right? That a conservative movement, as we're describing, which is a political movement, has to be intellectually coherent. And by the way, that includes being moral, right? It has to be consistent with justice ultimately. And it also has to be politically viable. There has to be a pathway forward whereby it might attract a following beyond just a few people who like to write and read essays on American conservatism. So is fusionism the pathway forward? There's interesting debate within this group of 22 pieces that I think is helpful for us to review, and maybe the two sides of this debate. So Neil Freeman, who offers a piece, probably the oldest member of the symposium, was actually involved in putting together that 1964 book, and then was a producer for Firing Line, William F. Buckley's PBS show, long-running PBS show. So he's been around through this whole period, and he argues, maybe not surprisingly, that fusionism still works. But it works only if everybody is able to show, as he says, a dash of epistemological humility, which is perhaps none of our specialties, but it should be a conservative specialty. That's part of the conservative outlook. There's a lot of things we don't know. There's a lot of flaws and faults in human nature. So we should be epistemically humble, but maybe that's still personally challenging for us. He argues that if we reconstruct this coalition, the error perhaps of the last 50 years has been that the social conservatives haven't had as honored a place as they deserve. That their commitment to the anti-abortion cause is the fundamental commitment, is the most noble and important cause, and that needs to be more honored and more central to a conservative movement going forward. That has to get to 51, to borrow Meyer's terminology, 51%, right? You've got to actually be able to win elections. William Ruger, who is with the Koch Foundation, similarly argues that fusionism can still work, that social conservatives, although he's of the more libertarian persuasion, as a Koch Foundation person would be, that social conservatives remind us, he says, that there are certain values that are foundational to a well-functioning free society, and that should be taken into account in thinking about political things moving forward. And I think he's trying to essentially reformulate the Meyer thesis in the language of our day. So there's two people that are saying, in essence, fusionism, not just the idea of trying to make a coalition, but the specific coalition that Meyer himself is proposing, that can still work. Although, at least in the case of Freeman, we might need to rebalance the effort. Okay, so that's the first position. On the other hand, there's several members of the symposium that are essentially saying, no, it didn't work. Good riddance, we need something else. So Julius Klein, who is the editor of American Affairs, his piece rather subtly titled, "Conservatism is a Collection of Losers. It doesn't have to be," argues, in essence, that the only piece that had any lasting impact out of that collection was the one that was written by a person who said he wasn't a conservative, namely Friedrich Hayek. And so what actually happened intellectually was all the other positions lost. This fusionism didn't work, except insofar as that Hayek was successful in promoting market economies, that's the one essay, again, ironically, the one that says it's not conservative, that actually was successful. And so he concludes, what is conservatism? Who cares? It doesn't matter. It failed, in essence. David Azarid, who's now at Hillsdale College, you could say is even more unsparing in his assessment of the success of the conservative movement. He says American conservatism is fiddling while Rome burns, that it has to recognize the fact that we lost, they won, and they is the progressive movement. Progressivism, he says, is triumphant and must be combated by a new right with the same tools that's used to secure the victory of progressives. And so he emphasizes the need to defund the institutions of the left, to establish new institutions, to use political power. He says no one, not even the great Reagan, has succeeded in taming the administrative welfare state, much less scaling it back. The right must be comfortable wielding the levers of state power, and it should emulate the left in using them to reward friends and punish enemies within the confines of the rule of law, he adds parenthetically. So here's kind of the landscape of debate on the question of whether fusionism as a certain understanding of conservatism still is viable in our day. What do you think, Dave? Has fusionism political or intellectual life left in it?
Well, it needs to have both. And I think the way that I would respond to Krein and to Azarod's essays is that I don't think that they rightly appreciate the intellectual argument that's being made by Meyer in 1964. Well, in fact, I can't see that they take on that argument at all in their essays. But But if you don't understand the argument and you don't understand why it's necessary to understand, to use Meyer's terms, the corpus of Western belief, you wouldn't be able thereafter to understand how an understanding of that Western corpus of belief could actually lead to the political consequences that you desire. So I think that we haven't done a good job as conservatives, although many a conservative believes differently here. I don't think we've done a good job of defining what conservatism is from 1964 to the present day to a society. I think that it has, in many ways, taken on an easier, simpler label, but there's not the depth of thought that originally went into kind of discovering the idea itself. I'll give you an example. One of the most beautiful books on conservatism and why one should be a conservative is Whittaker Chambers' Witness. But how many American college students would have any understanding of what Whittaker Chambers says in that essay? Very few. Well, why? Because no one reads it any longer. No one reads that book any longer. So you might have individuals who become members of Turning Point USA, and think of themselves as kind of holding up the conservative standard, but they don't even know the classics of what it means to be a conservative. So I would say that in order to revitalize conservatism, we have to actually teach people once again what it is, and when you do that, it will have a good political result. It's very amenable to political majorities, I think, because it takes into account the drive among many to want to rightly embrace freedom, where freedom can be ordered in a way that's beneficial to the human being, and rightly embrace virtue because it's so essential to right living. And I think that's not only a right philosophical argument, but a winning political argument. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, for me, sort of two responses to this debate. Number one, I think that the critics and kind of the tone of the critics is a dangerous one for conservatives. So if we recognize that conservatism that simply wants to hold on to what we have is inadequate for our time, that what Meyer calls militant conservatism is in some sense necessary, there's a way of doing militancy that's still consistent with using just means toward just ends, and there's a way of doing militancy that just is militant, right? That's just about power and force. And there's too much of that, in my view, in the emerging new right, whatever group you want to call that, the Trumpist right, the Flight 93, every election is our last chance to save civilization, therefore do what's ever necessary in order to win, right? That fight back, punch back, that whole combative spirit, I think is ultimately self-destructive, in that what will result from that might be short-term victories, but you end up creating a context where politics is just about power. And when politics is just about power, ultimately right will lose. Right? We don't have any confidence in human beings that by nature we're so good that if it's just a matter of force, then sure, force is definitely going to lead to the triumph of justice and right. There's no reason to believe that based upon historical examples. So,
I agree completely, and I think that in that case, both Azerrad and Krein in particular, fall trap to what I would call the Thrasymachus trap.
Right.
Justice is the advantage of the stronger. I mean, you just read what he has to say there. The only vision that triumphed was Hayek's vision. So the alternatives failed. Well, just because something failed doesn't mean that it still doesn't weight our interest and has merit and may have led to a better conclusion. So when he says, what is conservatism at this point, who cares? You can say the same thing about a variety of different things that are good in this world. What is great art? Well, who cares? What is Aristotle? Who cares? But we should care about these things because these things will lead us back and society back in a better direction.
Now, I think if, on the other hand, I were to critique the Meyer project just a little bit, I would say that at least practically, the synthesis that he attempted lent too much weight on the libertarian side. And so if you think about the argument, in essence, is the political project is freedom. That's the common goal we're going to work toward. We want you social conservatives to join us in pursuing freedom, because we know that the pursuit of virtue is really a private matter. It depends upon families and churches. It's not going to be something that the government's going to mandate. We can't force you to be good. And so therefore, we will work together to maximize freedom. That's essentially the political program that comes out of Meyer. And the problem is the libertarians got off the hook when it came to defending those institutions where virtue was supposed to be inculcated. So over that 50-year period of time, what happens when the Supreme Court in Griswold versus Connecticut invents a right to privacy that by 5 years later turns into a right of contraceptives for everybody, and 3 years after that, we've got Roe versus Wade, we've got no-fault divorce in there, we've got in more recent years, same-sex marriage. Libertarians are not fighting common cause with social conservatives against these things. They're on the sidelines or maybe cheering them on as expressions of what I would say is a misguided understanding of liberty. I remember, I think you talked to Charles Murray some years ago when you were down in DC, and I think you asked him, if I remember correctly, well, what percentage of libertarians are pro-life, right? And what was his answer?
Yep.
10%? And
well, it was interesting. He said, well, at the time, and I love the man. I think he's great. He was talking about this coalition of the Leave Me Alone. The coalition of Leave Me Alone will lead the country in the right direction. And we had just done a symposium on Washington, and I said, can a country have a national character that's based upon the proposition "Leave me alone"? And Murray, intellectually honest as he is, said, I doubt that. So there's something wrong with that coalition. So, but Murray's more interesting, right, than the average libertarian on that front. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think he's in that 10%, right, if I recall correctly, of pro-life libertarians. So my point is that if we say, well, virtue is a matter for the family or for the churches, the government can make it impossible or nearly impossible for the family to cultivate virtue. And in more recent years, perhaps for the church to cultivate virtue. So the libertarians of this coalition are going to have to agree that part of their job is not just to maximize freedom, but actually to create a context in which the family and these other institutions can survive and even flourish. And that's what I think, helpfully, a couple of the pieces, Yuval Levin of AEI, always very thoughtful on these things, talks about conservatism as being founded in a tragic view of human nature, that the human person is imperfect, broken, perhaps fallen, and yet also created in a divine image. And so he talks about the need to protect those institutions that are there to hold us together, to encourage us toward the good when we're not naturally inclined in that direction. The family, religion, culture, politics, education, civil society, the economy. Says these are what we want to conserve and to build upon. And then Chris Buskirk, who is the editor of American Greatness, makes a similar point, but he focuses on government, family, and church, and says that political conservatism is about recognizing and protecting those two natural pre-political institutions, namely the family and church. So again, we're talking about reformulating this fusionist coalition in a way that puts emphasis on the thing that was de-emphasized, I think it's fair to say, in the Frank Meyer original, that the need to preserve the family and the church as those institutions through which our highest aspirations are achieved is got to be central to the political project. And the libertarian side of the conservative movement is going to have to recognize that and recognize the need for positive political action on their part toward that end.
Yeah, I like what you have to say about that critique of Meyer, that perhaps there was that imbalance in the movement, because the progressive waves falling upon America in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, they continue to move things in a certain direction that would be very favorable to the position of some within libertarian circles that embrace freedom. Perhaps my favorite statement, on this, that in a reply to a need for a better balance is there's a great essay by Irving Kristol that I use in my classes called Capitalism, Socialism, and Nihilism. And he says at the end of the essay, because he was very critical of this belief that somehow libertarians could defeat nihilists on their own, he says, what medicine does one prescribe for a social order that is sick because it has lost its soul? So, Kristol realizes, right, that the issue at hand is actually the notion of the soul or the transcendent that's been lost as things have been moved further and further afield in a progressive direction.
All right, well, we are going to open the grade book now, as we do each week. And last week, we created our own grading system with animals. Don't want to miss that. Go back and check out that episode if you did miss it. And on our back to school, a lot of the big sports news this week was around what's going to happen with college football. And you had this split decision where 3 of the Power 5 conferences, the SEC, the ACC, and the Big 12 decided to play. At least they're still planning to play this fall. Whereas the Pac-12 and the Big 10 have decided to try to play in the spring. And so obviously the question is, well, can there be a national champion in a context like that? The head of the NCAA says there's not going to be any NCAA champions for the fall sports, but the college football national championship isn't actually determined by the NCAA. The college football playoff selection committee is independent of that. It's owned by a variety of people, including ESPN. So they're moving ahead, and they're meeting, and they're putting out tweets and making plans. They've got their whole process in place. So what we're going to do is grade 3 ways of solving this problem, of figuring out a national champion, or the conundrum of could there be a national champion in this context. All right, so Dave, give me your grades for each of these as we work our way through them. Number 1, just give the playoff champion the title. So we're going to have SEC, ACC, Big 12, leaving out the Pac-10, the Pac-12 and the Big 10. We can pretty much, if we want to, imagine that Ohio State lost in the semifinals. Pac-12 champion won't be good enough anyway. And it's going to come down, as it always does, to Alabama and Clemson. So why do we need the other 2 conferences? What do you think about that one, Dave?
Because you never know until you play the game. I'm going to give that one an F. Ohio State actually may be pretty good this year. So
yeah, you're right.
It may be that once in a decade where they actually beat Clemson or Alabama. So yeah, I don't like that as a solution. I think that it. I wonder why these conferences, the Power 5, couldn't work together to come up with a season where they played, even if that meant spring. So that one's an F if you have 3 going forward and 2 aren't there. I don't like that solution.
Okay. All right. Very good. Yeah. I'm going to give that a D. I don't think it's very good either. I think it just seems sort of silly to raise a championship trophy and know that 2 of the major conferences that are, viable contenders for this, and some of the teams that no doubt were expected to be very, very good, didn't even compete. All right. Second option, split national champions. So you've got your 3 conferences that do the fall football. Then in the spring, you've got like a, Rose Bowl 2, where, true champion of the Pac-12 against the Big 10 champion. You actually have it when roses are really in bloom in most parts of the country. So that's something. And the only difficulty here is the Rose Bowl is actually part of the college football playoff. So I'm not sure, you may need a new name for this, some other flower or something like that to make this work. But leaving that aside, you've got 1 national champion for the fall, 1 for the spring, and it's just like the old days, the 90s, the 80s, where we got to debate who was the real champion, and we never knew because they never played it on the field.
I actually like this. I think that, before you had an NFL, you had an AFC and an NFC, right? You had different champions there. You'll have, I believe, a playoff in the fall. And I think that they ought to do something similar in the spring. Maybe, they do semis and then a final game in the fall and do a similar thing in the spring. And then, a co-champion. This team won the fall, this team won the spring, and go from there. So I'd give that, it's not an A because it's not ideal, but I'd give it a solid B anyway as a resolution.
Yeah, I mean, it's good for the T-shirt manufacturers. It's, kind of keeps the debate going. All right, the last option here we're going to throw out is to make the conference championships basically the big piece of hardware. So you play your conference schedule. They're all playing these intra-conference schedules. And then you have like an NCAA basketball style tournament where the top 6 or 8 teams or whatever from each conference play. And so, you have a chance to have a regular season champion, a tournament champion, and that's the big trophy. There's no attempt to try to figure out a national champion. We got 5 conference champions, and they all celebrate that they're at the top of the heap, at least for their conference that year.
Yeah, kind of boring. You could do it. I can't see the excitement. Of course, Ohio State Michigan game in the spring is still going to be Ohio State Michigan game, and perhaps for the Big Ten championship, there'd be something there. But overall, I mean, college football has become a national sport, so to turn it back into kind of a conference level championship, I think would be a little anticlimactic. So I'm going to give that one a C-.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm going to have to grade that one low also, because it just doesn't – there's nothing new about it, right? You play your conference schedule, and then you play off within the conference. And so we're just having rematches of the same teams that have already played. All right, well, we'll see how they work it out. All this TBD. It seems like there's more moves to be made before this is all settled. But we'll see if anyone plays college football in the fall in the end. They've got about a month and a half to figure it out in these conferences that are trying to play. And so perhaps they can pull it off. That would be at least be entertaining for us to have college football year round. That would be something for the fans. Let's give that at least an A for the fan of college football, who gets to watch a fall season and a spring season perhaps as well. Well, we always close the show with the Tocqueville's crystal ball. And last week we predicted the result of Ilhan Omar's congressional primary against her fellow progressive Democrat, Anton Melton Moe. Now, Dave, you predicted she would win by 10 points, which pretty good. I said 18, however, which means I think for the first time in 12 episodes, we actually have a correct prediction. 18-point spread. It actually was an 18-point spread. So on the other hand, we'd also predicted the vice presidential choice. I had said Susan Rice. You had said Elizabeth Warren. Obviously, we got that wrong. So that's more in keeping with our normal predictions. This week, we're going to have a little bit of fun with the convention coming up. As I said, next week, we're going to spend the whole show on the convention. The next 2 weeks, we'll do the Democratic convention, the Republican convention. But we're going to have a little bit of fun with the speeches coming up. So you got 2 hours of primetime speeches, 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock Eastern. This is where your time zone advantage really kicks in, Dave, because I'm going to be up past my bedtime 4 nights in a row trying to keep up with these speeches. Meanwhile, you can have your cocktail, your dinner, your after-dinner port, whatever you're doing out there on the left coast. 8 o'clock, it's all done. You still got a little time for an evening. Got to say I'm jealous.
Then I have the evening to have to think about what was actually said, which may be disturbing as well. So there's that element, but
That's
it's not
true.
It's not right before bed, so it won't create nightmares, or hopefully
I know.
not.
I'm wondering if I'll be able to fall asleep after all this.
Exactly. But yeah, no, I think it's I always like conventions. I just kind of the political part of me growing up. I always thought they were neat, Republican, Democratic, to see people speak. It's going to be weird though without any crowd. That's always the fun part about it, seeing people respond to the speeches. So
the crazy hats and
yes, exactly.
the enthusiasm and the chants and all the rest. Yeah, it's going to be wild, and to see how the speakers respond to that. When you have the applause line, there's no applause. What do you do? And do you write a different speech because there's no audience to hit those applause lines, the kind of cadence that you normally use with a teleprompted speech with applause lines and a crowd? It's just a totally different experience. So we'll see how they adjust to that.
It's like teaching an 8 o'clock class on a Tuesday, Thursday. All right.
On Zoom.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So what we're going to do is make a prediction for each night. We got one speaker each night. We're going to have a question related to that, and we'll see how we do. Join along. This is a great opportunity. This would be a good Instagram thing. You want to join along. Make your predictions. Join with us and see how we all do. So Monday night, Michelle Obama is giving the keynote address. And, back in the days when President Obama was speaking State of the Union addresses, one of the things you always would notice was just how many times he would use first-person singular pronouns, right? He likes to talk about himself. And so, most narcissists marry people that kind of fuel that a little bit. So the question I have for you, Dave, is how many times does Michelle Obama mention Barack Obama in her keynote address, presumably in support of Joe Biden?
I would say every other paragraph of her speech.
Okay.
I'm going early and often.
Early and often. All right.
There'll be a lot of he's and we's.
Right. Okay.
So,
yeah. Okay. I'm gonna say 5 times because I'm a number person, and I think sounds like you're saying at least that. But
I'll say at least a dozen. Then I'll give you
a dozen.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Very good. All right. So now that's Monday night. Now Tuesday night features Dr. Joe Biden and Bill Clinton. And I think Clinton's a very interesting figure here because, of course, he's one of those guys that just made his political career in the convention speech and knows how to deal with the crowd. So, but in recent years, he's somewhat in a precarious position with the woke Democratic Party. And so my question to you is, Dr. David Corbin, will he directly or implicitly apologize for any of his past actions or policies? Welfare reform, policing, sexual harassment. He's got a pretty good list of things he could apologize for. Any of those you think he'll bring up and at least give a nod to where the party is today?
Never, not in our lifetime. It'll never happen. So it's just not part of his makeup.
I agree. He brazens it out all the way to the end. But no, I think there's no apologies. I think Bill Clinton goes on being Bill Clinton right to the end.
Yes.
All right. Wednesday night, a lot of heavy hitters. We've got Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren, Nancy Pelosi, and of course, Kamala Harris's vice presidential acceptance speech. Now, the narrative so far from the media has been how well she's doing as attack dog, going after Trump in ways that maybe Biden wouldn't want to do or hasn't done, and the success she's having with that. So my question for you then is, how many times does she mention Trump by name? And does she ever call him President Trump?
I think also a dozen references to the president. Never with his title president. So not one President Trump, but many references to the current office holder.
Okay. I was going to say 10 Trumps, and I agree with you. None of them preceded by the word president. Okay. Now, we come to the main event, Thursday night, the Biden acceptance speech. He's been waiting a long time for this, right? When we think about it, the first time he ran for president, he ran against Bush. That's George H.W. Bush, 1988. So he's got it, though. He's got the nomination, 32 years in the making, but they don't seem super eager to give him a lot of camera time. You may have noticed, not a lot of camera time for Joe Biden at this point. So I got 2 questions for you. Number 1, quick question. How long will the acceptance speech be? I'm not counting the introductory video or the family thing at the end. The speech itself from start to finish, how long is the speech?
22 minutes, perhaps a record for how short it is. I don't know. We've heard that Truman was 26 minutes. So yeah, I'm saying less than 26 minutes.
Less than 26. I'm going to go shorter still. I'm going to say it's going to be 15 minutes. I'm going to say there's going to be a long video. So you're going to think that it's the speech, but it's not the speech. And then there's going to be a lot of stuff at the end. And so it's going to be up there for like a half hour, 35 minutes, wherever there is. But you're going to look at it and you're going to say, wait a second, he barely spoke at all. That was 15 minutes. Right, I'm going to say 15 minutes, maybe less. All right, now last question. Imagine you're playing acceptance speech bingo, and you want to construct the perfect board to guarantee your bingo. We all know you got that star space in the middle. So you need four X's in order to get your bingo. I want 4 words you would love to see lined up on your bingo board to guarantee you win acceptance speech bingo next Thursday night.
Build, back, better, and unite. They're simple. You can say them over and over again, even within 22 minutes. Build, back, better, unite.
I'm a little disappointed you didn't go with a 4th B, but that's okay. Barack? No. Okay. All right. So that's good. I like those. I like those choices. I was going to say no articles or helping birds. We didn't go there, so that's fine. All right. Here's my 4. Literally
is good.
Famous abuser of that word. Decency, obviously describing himself. incompetent, obviously describing the president, and then man in the sense of, come on, man, which seems to be his favorite reply to a reporter who gives him a question he doesn't like.
Yeah, that malarkey, right? He likes that.
Malarkey.
Well.
Yeah. So. Malarkey might work in there too. That's not a bad fifth word. All right. Well, we'll see how we do on that. I think our predictions are pretty similar, so there may not be a clear-cut winner, but I'm looking forward to the bingo especially and seeing how we do. I have a feeling we might both get bingo on that Thursday night if the speech isn't too short.
We'll have to count how many we get of Build Back Better and Unite and yours. So.
Yeah. Very good. All right. Well, that's all we've got for this week's show. Thanks as always for listening. Please remember to subscribe and to review the show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher, and to follow us on Instagram at Democracy in America Today. We look forward to being back with you again next week.